winds down, we'd like to leave you with a sense of how the world order is changing. No one better to do that than John Chipman, the Director General of the IISS, or the International Institute of Strategic Studies. John, thank you so much for speaking to us here in Davos. We're coming to the end of summer Davos, so to speak, but we're leaving on a tense note of the continuing hostility in Europe, the war that Russia has initiated against Ukraine, and how it's polarizing the world. What do you expect will be the outcome of this?
Well, for North Americans and Europeans, the classic West, as it were, the European security order is a core interest, to use a Chinese phrase. And so it was inevitable that we would look at a Russian invasion of Ukraine as upsetting the security architecture that had done so much for Europe and North America the last 70 years. And this wasn't a Russian invasion just to occupy parts of the territory. It was a Russian invasion to take over all of Ukraine. It was an imperialist project. So Europeans and North Americans remain very committed to ensuring that Russia is expelled from Ukraine. The analogy is what happened in 1990 in the Middle East when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the determination then was to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Otherwise, he might go further, even into Saudi Arabia. Then the Middle East security order was at stake. Now it's the European security order.
And how do you expect this to end? Because it's not clear which way this war is going. Ukrainians have put up a brave defense, of course, with large amounts of assistance financially as well as from a military point of view from powers across the West. But it doesn't seem like it's at a decisive point right now at all.
The short answer is the war will end as Ukraine's choice. Ukraine has agency here. Putin expected that he would be in Kyiv in 3 days, a puppet government installed, and he would have de facto sovereignty all of Ukraine. That didn't happen. 80 days have passed. Ukrainians have resisted well, taken huge losses, many Russian war crimes evidently committed, but it's Ukraine's choice. So long as Ukraine is determined to continue fighting, European and North American friends and partners of Ukraine will continue to deliver equipment, training, intelligence, and assistance of all kinds until Ukraine feels that it can dictate the terms of a peace settlement.
In your assessment, how long can Ukraine continue to put up this front?
I think it's very important to look at the next 7 or 8 weeks. For a moment, there's an arms race gap. The kind of equipment that is now being delivered to Ukraine is NATO standard equipment. That means Ukrainians need to be trained on it. They don't yet know how to operate it, cannot yet absorb it. So they have to continue to survive the next 3 or 4 weeks in eastern Ukraine. If they survive that period and are still being able to fight, they could start turning things in another direction. But it's a war that could still last many, many months.
If it doesn't go that way, and if Russia does prevail, what do you expect will be then the balance of power in at least this part of the world?
The determination on the part of the United States and on the principal European allies that Russia just can't prevail. And Russia won't be able to prevail on its terms. The risk is that at a certain point, they declare their desire for a ceasefire when they realize that they can't gain more territory. And President Zelensky will be put under great pressure then, because he won't want to agree to a ceasefire that only provides a rest for the Russians, an ability for them to recoup themselves, organize themselves, and then try again. Even the national security advisor to Mr. Putin, Patrushev, said only the other day, we need the full denazification of Ukraine. If it takes 1, 2, 3 years, we will continue. So Russian war aims remain very large, and the West can't allow Russia to prevail.
I hesitate to even mention this, but there is fear that there might be the use of nuclear weapons or at least chemical weapons. Do you expect that to pan out?
I think the chance is not zero, but it's really minimal for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's no real military advantage to be gained on the battlefield by the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. The second is that there are a number of people in the decision chain in Russia who would have to approve a tactical weapons use, and there's a risk that someone might say no. And then the third and most obvious reason is that there would be a huge conventional response from the West, and of course, the West has nuclear weapons too, 3 different decision centers, Washington, Paris, and London. So it would be a really high risk for Putin to do that, and I doubt it would happen.
Yes, I didn't want to underscore it, but didn't want to ignore it
Yeah,
either because it is a part of the conversation
absolutely.
across the world. If this does go your way, if Ukraine is able to repel this Russian attack, what do you expect will be the new order in Europe? We're already seeing Finland and Sweden wanting in on NATO, and Ukraine's been speaking about wanting to become a member of the EU. I think they've put to rest their desire to become a member of NATO, but definitely a member of the EU. How do you see things changing here in Europe?
I think the center of political gravity is moving towards the east and towards the north. The Franco German engine is not the only propellant of European security or economic stability. The Finnish decision to enter NATO was really the most dramatic one because for 70 years they felt that their position of military neutrality, of course, politically they were already a member of the European Union, but military neutrality was serving them reasonably well. Now there's a fear of Russia. There's a total lack of trust in Russia. So their previous strategic stance was untenable. This is Putin's enlargement of NATO. There was no effort of NATO to include Sweden and Finland. As a result of Putin's actions, 20% of Finland's population only 3 months ago was in favor of joining NATO. 20% moved to 80%. In Sweden, it was a small minority. That moved to a majority. The only thing that happened in between was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's Putin's enlargement of NATO.
John, many experts on this issue believe that um, this attack by Russia has been provoked in some ways by the West's intervention in Ukraine's own sovereign decisions. Uh, that's the best way I can put it without getting into details of history. Do you agree with that? That this was in many ways provoked by the West and that they gave Ukraine false hope?
The West said in 2008 that the door was open to Ukraine for NATO membership. They did that at a time when they weren't yet ready to welcome Ukraine. In 2014, the Crimea was occupied and taken, and there was no Western response then. And between 2014 and this year, there were no steps being taken to bring Ukraine into NATO. There was no advance in that schedule to bring Ukraine into NATO. And the concern that Putin had in 2014 was not about NATO, it was about Ukraine leaning into the European Union. Now, of course, Ukraine wishes to join both the European Union and eventually NATO, but that's a consequence of Russia's invasion and desire to take over the sovereignty of Ukraine. The key point is that Putin has said in his own words, in a 5,000-word essay that he published last year, that Ukraine wasn't really a nation. So the EU and NATO were sort of cosmetic excuses. The real reason was that Putin wanted to recover Ukraine into Russian sovereignty, as he has de facto already done with Belarus.
Where does this leave Russia?
Russia will be left probably as a very diminished power. Many countries in the Middle East and in Asia understandably have wanted to hedge in the multipolar world and have decided to maintain decent relations with Russia. The
Including
problem for those, including India, is that Russia's strategic currency is in decline. And so it's not a good time to be long Russia and short the United States or Europe. And India, that has depended hugely on a Russian military relationship and Russian arms, may find by the end of this calendar year that the spare parts, the maintenance for that Russian equipment is not there, which is why the United States and others have offered to backfill if one discovers that, in fact, Russian equipment is not so operable in the coming years. And certainly the ability of Russia to maintain exports into the Middle East and Asia and other markets will be very difficult starting already the beginning of next year.
Do you foresee an arms race, and an interesting one at that, given the weaponization of both finance and energy in this current situation? Because it does seem like an increasingly friendless world, even though the West has come together in this case to back Ukraine.
I think the two most extraordinary things that have happened in the last couple of months that affect both Europe and Asia is that 2 months ago, Chancellor Scholz of Germany announced that he would inject 100 billion euros into the German defense budget and move to the NATO standard 2%. That would make Germany the third biggest defense spender in the world after US and China. And then only a couple of weeks ago, the LDP party in Japan recommended to Prime Minister Kishida that Japan move to the NATO standard of 2% GDP defense expenditure, which would move Japan into third place, pushing Germany into fourth. Who would have imagined only a year ago that the third and fourth biggest defense spenders in the world would be Japan and Germany? So that shows what Putin's aggression has done to the international order and to the importance of defense expenditure to ensure national security.
Where do you see India's place in all of this?
Well, India has been a country that has wanted to engage in multi-alignment, ensure strong relations in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, in North America, while still being a friend and partner to the global South in Africa and Latin America. But a perfectly balanced multi-alignment policy is now becoming very difficult to prosecute. I think there was a good Quad meeting held recently in Tokyo. The communique is a strong communique, and it's a good thing that that summit took place. But everybody realized that there are very different strategic accents amongst the four countries of the Quad. We at the IISS look forward to receiving your defense minister and the defense ministers of the other three Quad members of our IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and to animate a strong debate, ensuring that all perspectives are heard.
Okay, I have two quick last questions. One, what do you see the impact of all of this on trade and business? So many people have been calling the end of globalization over the last several months now. Did you buy into that?
I think it's true that with the combination of both COVID and the way that has interrupted supply chains, and this war and the way it's involved so many economic sanctions against Russia and de facto or de jure secondary sanctions against other countries, there are bits of decoupling taking place. There's also, I think, now a hesitancy amongst some Western companies to invest at speed in China when they're not quite certain how the zero COVID policy will emerge, and some worries obviously about how Russia decreasing as an economic partner for many will accept things. So certainly finance is a big issue. A large question will be the bill for reparations in Ukraine. And there's a mood in some Western capitals to move from freezing Russian state assets to seizing Russian state assets. So that $400 billion cost of reconstructing Ukraine is met by Russian assets and is not at the cost of the developing world, that we in the West are not having to restrain our development assistance to the developing world because of the high cost of reconstructing Ukraine. And if that debate were to move forward, that will be a big issue for financial markets and for the issue of how globalization can continue in the way we imagined it would.
Definitely. Final question. We have not discussed US and China as much in this Davos as we have in previous Davoses, especially during President Trump's time. What do you make of that relationship and where it fits in this changing world order as you've described it?
I'm not a subscriber to the simple idea that there's a US-China Cold War, but clearly the technological cooperation is very important. It's obvious also that people in the United States and in the Biden administration are concerned about the creeping security influence that China has, including the Pacific Island states. State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi has this week visited 7 or 8 of those states. So first the South China Sea, now the Pacific Island states are being courted by China. That's shifting the perceived balance of power in Asia. So that is a concern. But at the same time, perhaps the war in Ukraine has given the Chinese a bit of a sense of pause as to what a military assault to forcibly unify Taiwan would mean. They've noticed Ukrainian national resistance. Taiwanese national resistance might be strong. So we can hope that for the next few years at least, there's a tough dialogue between the United States and China, but no military confrontation.
That's a comprehensive view of the world. John Chipman, thank you so much for speaking to us here at BQ Prime and for giving us a sense of what this summer Davos has achieved in terms of conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.